Washington lights blazed inside a grand ballroom where diplomatic handshakes masked hidden schemes of power. Amid the crowd, Jasmine Crockett, rising, star eyes burning with ambition, stepped in, ready to turn the immigration conference into her own stage. Across the room, Stephen Miller, former White House advisor and the controversial architect of the zero-tolerance policy that tore over 2,800 children from their parents, sat in stillness, quietly observing. When Jasmine dropped her unverified bomb of rumor, the hall erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously. Miller remained silent, but in his eyes flickered a restrained fury. Who would seize the upper hand in this political duel, the attacker wielding rumor, or the man biding his time for the counterstrike? Washington gleamed that evening, the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel echoing with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the relentless flashes of cameras. Yet behind the glittering facade lay a shadowy battlefield of politics, where every glance and every handshake carried with it a bargain or a hidden scheme. Jasmine Crockett entered her dark-toned gown, deliberately calculated to stand out among the sea of immaculate suits. She smiled radiantly, but her eyes remained hard-sharp, as though rehearsing a script only she knew. To Jasmine, this conference was never about immigration. It was a stage upon which she would prove she had the will to step into the heart of power, ruthless enough to trample over names already carved into the political pantheon. Across the room, Stephen Miller, the former White House advisor, sat in unshaken stillness, a block of ice amidst the roaring current. He did not need to smile, nor to clasp too many hands. His very name commanded caution. As architect of the infamous zero-tolerance policy, which tore over 2,800 children from their parents, he carried a political stain that could never be washed clean. The press branded him the architect of cruelty, and though the public despised him, they could never cease speaking of him. That paradox made him an unassailable presence in every debate. Jasmine saw him. They did not greet. They did not need to. The distance of several dozen feet was enough to forge a silent confrontation between one who sought to shred the past in order to rise, and one who had already touched the summit of power. She knew her moment had come. In politics, a rumor untested, unverified, could outweigh 100 facts, and Jasmine had brought with her such a bomb. The forum commenced. One speaker after another spoke of reforms of human rights of law. Elegant, well-polished words, but the hall seemed to hold its breath awaiting the drama. When the moderator introduced Jasmine Crockett, the spotlight swung onto her. She mounted the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled with measured confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jasmine began, her voice ringing clear, "we have heard too many numbers, too many reports. But what the public demands is the raw truth. And tonight, I bring to you a truth that some in this very room may not wish to hear." The hall fell silent. Pencils froze. Cameras stopped clicking. Jasmine raised her chin, her eyes glittering with defiance. "I have learned," she paused, drawing suspense, "that decisions regarding the child separation policy were not only driven by national security fears, but also by personal gain. Illicit funds flowed into the pockets of those who designed this policy. And the name behind it all, as you well know, is Mr. Stephen Miller." The air detonated. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised, cameras flashing wildly. Whispers and even gasps rippled through the room. The accusation, though unproven, landed with the force of a hammer, quickening every heartbeat. Stephen Miller did not flinch. He sat motionless, his face, expressionless eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Only his right hand tightening around his glass betrayed tension, his knuckles pale against the crystal. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Miller!" Do you have any response to this accusation?" The spotlight swung to him. Every gaze converged. Stephen set down his glass and rose slowly. He neither rushed nor faltered. His gravelly voice carried without the aid of a microphone, silencing the hall. "How amusing," he said, "that an ambitious newcomer chooses fabrication as her ladder to glory. I am no stranger to such tactics. In politics, lies often outrun the truth. But let me be clear, not a single dollar, not a shred of personal interest ever dictated my decisions. The policy I crafted, though harsh, was rooted in law and in the defense of national security. If you wish to turn the suffering of children into a political weapon, perhaps you should examine yourselves first." The hall convulsed. Some applauded. Others sat stone-faced. Jasmine maintained her smile, though tension flickered in her eyes. She had not expected Miller to counter so swiftly. She opened her mouth to continue, but he was already striding toward the podium, facing her head-on, transforming the conference into a public tribunal. Congresswoman Crockett Miller declared, "If you have evidence, present it here and now. If not, I will consider this defamation and explore legal action for slander. I have endured dozens of hearings before Congress and stared down hundreds of journalists. I am well accustomed to pressure. But are you? Are you prepared to face the legal consequences?" The question cut like a blade. Jasmine faltered for an instant, then recovered. "Mr. Miller," she replied, "the court of public opinion is one you cannot control. I don't need to produce evidence tonight. The people will demand answers. And once the question spread, no one will believe in your innocence anymore." Murmurs surged anew. This time, Miller fell silent. His gaze locked on Jasmine, eyes burning as though to sear through her confident mask. That evening was no longer a conference on immigration. It had become a duel, one combatant, wielding rumor as a weapon, the other brandishing law and composure as his shield. The press churned relentlessly, breaking news banners racing across every network. America had been handed a courtroom spectacle in real time. Jasmine left the podium with a strained smile. Inside, she knew she had struck her target shock, yet she also understood Miller would not forgive. His eyes before turning away were not those of defeat, but a chilling warning the game had only begun. Stephen Miller departed the hall in silence, his steps slow, each one resounding like a judge's gavel. He did not need to shout, no need to spar further. He had already planted a counter-question in the public mind. Was Jasmine merely a power-hungry opportunist, exploiting suffering to rise? The night ended, but its tremors reverberated across Washington. Major outlets splashed their headlines. Crockett drops. A rumor. Bomb Miller strikes back with legal threats. New battle in politics. Will truth or rumor prevail? In a nearby bar, a cluster of reporters whispered, "Whoever wins tonight, American politics," staged a drama rivaling Broadway. And Jasmine, seated in her car, gazed out the window, her eyes glimmering with a cocktail of pride and dread. She knew this game would not end with a rumor. It would draw hearings, old files dragged into daylight, enemies creeping from the shadows. And she, a rising star, had stepped fully onto an arena where the line between triumph and ruin had never been so perilously thin. The atmosphere thickened as the formal discussion began. Microphones passed from hand to hand, politicians taking turns to speak of humanity, of law, of borders, and responsibility. Yet all of it felt like a lackluster prelude, for everyone awaited the more explosive moment, and Jasmine Crockett knew it well. Seated in the front row, her dark dress neat and composed, Jasmine smiled with a quiet confidence, as though she herself had orchestrated this evening's spectacle. She drew a deep breath, then signaled for the microphone. The moderator nodded, and in an instant both the lights and every gaze converged upon her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jasmine began, her voice calm, yet calculated. "We speak of immigration, but there is a truth often concealed, the zero-tolerance policy. It is not just sterile numbers. It is thousands of children torn from their parents, crying in the frigid detention centers along the border." The hall buzzed. The phrase "zero tolerance" instantly ignited bitter memories in the American conscience. Some reporters snapped open their laptops, keys clattering, knowing the words they typed could land on tomorrow's front page. Jasmine paused, casting a sidelong glance at Stephen Miller. He sat immobile, shoulders squared, face carved from stone. That composure only stoked her fire. And she continued, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, amplified by the microphone. "I have reason to believe something even graver. That Mr. Miller deliberately concealed internal data, willfully withholding the full count of affected children in order to shield certain senior officials of the previous administration." The room exploded. Her words landed like a grenade. Camera flashes strobed furiously. Reporters pressed forward, swarming around Miller's section. A rumor. No proof yet. But in politics, rumor is the fuel of drama, the spark that can consume a career overnight. Jasmine knew this strike would ensure her name rang through Washington by morning. A reporter shouted, "Congresswoman Crockett. Do you have evidence? What is the source of this claim?" Jasmine smiled, tilting her head slightly, her eyes glinting with suggestion. In politics, evidence is not always available at once, but when the public begins asking questions, the guilty will reveal themselves. Ambiguous, but potent enough to spin the matter into a vortex. The crowd erupted, some lawmakers shaking their heads, others smirking as if they had just witnessed a masterstroke. Stephen Miller still said nothing. He sat upright, gaze fixed upon Jasmine. In the golden light, his eyes flashed with restrained fury. He made no unnecessary move, just a stare heavy enough to crush. Jasmine savored the moment. She knew dozens of cameras captured her expression, the smile, the gleaming eyes, the calculated tilt of her head. She did not need to prove anything, only to sow suspicion in the minds of the public. She swept her gaze across the hall, noting faces alight with excitement, as if watching a live courtroom drama. Politics had ceased to be a policy debate. It had become a theater where every gesture turned into a weapon. Mr. Miller, Jasmine deliberately called his name. Her voice, sharp as a blade. "If you are innocent, why not release the complete data from the beginning? Why let the public stumble in darkness for years?" The murmurs grew frantic, the question drilling into the silence surrounding Miller. At last, he set his glass upon the table and leaned forward slightly. His face remained unchanged, but the air around him thickened. He needed no shouting. A single look sufficed to suggest the gavel was about to fall. He rose slowly, and the hall fell dead quiet. Miller adjusted his tie, a small gesture, yet heavy with authority. "It is unfortunate," he intoned, voice deep and resonant, "that a young congresswoman, instead of offering solutions to immigration, chooses to traffic in reckless rumors. I have never concealed any data. Every report was submitted to Congress and to independent oversight. If Representative Crockett has evidence, she may present it here and now. Otherwise, I consider this a deliberate act of defamation." His words struck like charges read in a courtroom. The audience held its breath. Jasmine did not retreat. She smirked faintly, eyes like sharpened glass. "Mr. Miller, you may threaten me with the law, but public opinion will not bend so easily. Once these questions spread, you will face not just me, but millions of voters demanding answers." Cameras flared again. Scattered applause broke out, no one was sure for whom. In that moment, the conference had transformed. It was no longer an immigration forum. It was a battlefield of accusation and rebuttal, of rumor and truth. Jasmine stood like a leading actress basking in ovation. Miller faced her like a prosecutor, cold and unyielding, awaiting the next hearing. But both understood this was merely the opening act. The rumor she planted would seep into every news channel, every family dinner table, every congressional hallway. And the real trial would begin when the public became a jury that no one could control. That night, as people left the hall, the first headlines lit up on Twitter: Crockett accuses Miller of concealing immigration data, a shocking strike. Miller fires. Back threatens lawsuit against young Congresswoman. Washington never lacked for scandal, but this strike of rumor was enough to make Jasmine the most mentioned name in the next 24 hours. In the car leaving the hotel, Jasmine folded her arms, eyes fixed on the distance. She knew rumors needed no truth to survive. They only needed an audience. And tonight, the whole of Washington had been her stage. The air inside the hall thickened like a pane of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest crack. Every sound, whispers, rustling papers, clattering keys died away. All eyes were fixed on Stephen Miller, waiting, yearning to see an explosive reaction. But Miller remained seated, eyes half-lidded, hand resting lightly on the table. Jasmine Crockett curled her lips into a cold smile. She believed she had lit the fuse. No evidence, no files, just a seed of suspicion sown before dozens of cameras. It would take root, cling to the public's memory, and resist being uprooted. She recalled the old formula of politics: rumor always outruns truth, and once the media joins in, truth, when it finally arrives, becomes nothing more than a faint footnote. The hall grew suffocating. Reporters exchanged glances, pens poised in the air, waiting to record Miller's first word. But the silence stretched, long enough to make some grow restless. Jasmine lifted her chin, her hair catching the glare of the lights, shimmering like glass. She savored each second of silence like an actress basking in the pinnacle of a performance. To her, Miller's silence equaled weakness defeat on the battlefield of public perception. Yet unease crept in. Miller was no amateur. He had survived dozens of hearings, hundreds of political assaults. If he remained silent, it could not be confusion. Her eyes met his, cold, deep, but not clouded. Inside lurked something dangerous, like a predator biding its time. From the back row, a journalist whispered, "What's he waiting for? Why not respond?" A colleague muttered back, "Maybe he's preparing another move." Miller's never been rash. He waits, then strikes at the weakest spot. Their hushed exchange carried clearly through the stillness commentary on the taut performance unfolding. Miller stayed seated, his gaze locked on Jasmine, wordless. His silence became contagious, turning into psychological pressure. A few lawmakers leaned forward, trying to read his lips. The longer it lasted, the more unsettled the room grew. Jasmine, smiling outwardly, felt a coil of discomfort inside. She wanted Miller to flare up, to lash out so she could counterstrike. But he had chosen to stand apart, letting the rumor spiral unchecked through the crowd. And that unsettled her. Most silence was no longer a defense, but preparation. In Miller's mind, everything turned like gears. He heard each accusation, each murmur. But rather than spar in the moment, he calculated. Rumors can be destroyed if the accused rushes to deny. He knew that if he reacted too quickly, the public would see him as defensive. But if he waited, arming himself with files with law, he could turn rumor into the clownish tool of its wielder. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. The weight of the public gaze pressed like hammers against flesh, but he was accustomed to such pressure. He would not let Jasmine dictate the rhythm of this battle. The moderator coughed lightly, trying to steer the program forward, but his voice shook. Everyone knew the forum had veered off course. It was no longer a roundtable on immigration. It had become a public trial, one side hurling accusations, the other silent with calculation. Another lawmaker lifted the microphone to speak, but froze when Miller's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. Fleeting, but enough to ripple through the hall, he was not afraid. He was preparing a move. Jasmine's heartbeat quickened. She hated this silence. It was like a rope, drawn endlessly taut, threatening to snap tight. She glanced toward the reporters' row and saw many eyes shifting to Miller, leaving her behind. A dangerous sign public opinion could pivot effortlessly. She forced her way back onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Miller's silence is itself an answer. If one is truly innocent, they do not shy away from the truth. But here he chooses silence because he knows there is something that cannot be revealed." The whispers surged again, but Miller did not respond. Only his unblinking gaze, patience wrapped in menace. At the back row, an older reporter smirked bitterly, murmuring, "This is not the silence of defeat. It's the silence of a man rewriting the script." Indeed, inside Miller's mind, a new script was taking shape. He would not play by Jasmine's rules. He would let the public ask, why did a young congresswoman choose rumor over evidence? He would turn her strike into a double-edged blade. The hall sagged into a heavy lull. No half-hearted applause, no shouted questions. Only a simmering tension, as though a trial had been cut short. People filed out with unanswered questions, but Miller knew he had won something crucial: time. He rose, bowed slightly, and left. No words, no defense, yet his silence thundered like an indictment aimed back at Jasmine. On his way to the car, Miller thought, "She wants fire and blood now. I won't give it. I'll let the fuse burn out and she'll be consumed by her own flames." Jasmine watched his retreating figure, fists clenched, her smile extinguished. She did not realize that his silence was not surrender, but the calm before a counterstrike. And when it came, the rumor she unleashed would cease to be a weapon and become the noose tightening around her own career. At the next hearing, the atmosphere was wound tight as a drawn bow. Stephen Miller rose slowly, his chair creaking faintly, just enough to make hundreds of heads turn toward him. In the dense air, every movement of his carried the weight of a trial. He stepped to the podium, laid his hand upon the polished wood, and swept his gaze across the chamber. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang steady, each word, like a nail driven into the floorboards. "I will not answer with rumor. I will answer with records." He opened his leather briefcase and drew out a thick stack of documents, their covers stamped in red with the seal of the Department of Justice and the report of the Inspector General. The entire room tensed with each page lifted into the air. Photographers lunged forward, flashes bursting like lightning in a storm. This, Miller stressed, is the independent inspector's report, filed, published, and preserved. It proves that all data concerning the zero-tolerance policy was transferred. There was no concealment. I challenge anyone in this room to produce a single shred of evidence to the contrary. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett blinked. Her smile held, but her hands clenched slightly on her lap. Miller pressed on. He flipped another page, his tone now iron. "The zero-tolerance policy was a mistake, I do not deny that. But it was not the mistake of one man. It was the product of an entire system, from the White House to the Department of Justice to law enforcement. I was the architect, and I accept my role. But let us be fair, if we keep fixating on one individual, we only deepen the pain of those 2,800 families once torn apart." The hall shuddered. His words were not excuses, but a calculated confession. Miller did not disown the past. He turned it into a shield. He paused, letting the silence thicken, then lowered his voice, slow and deliberate. "I, too, am the child of an immigrant family. My grandparents came to America with nothing were called outsiders, denied jobs, and bullied in schools. I grew up on stories of scorn, of fear, of being told we did not belong. The chamber hushed. Some leaned forward. Reporters halted their typing, lifting their heads, eyes locked on Miller. And so he continued, I believe in law. I believe immigration must have order, discipline. I do not want our children, your children, living in chaos. But I have never forgotten the tears my family endured, nor the cries of children in detention. I carry that stain in my political life, but I will not allow anyone to twist it into fiction. His voice caught not from weakness, but design. He knew how to wield emotion as a weapon. The chamber fell into complete silence. No whispers, no scraping chairs. Half the eyes that once burned toward Jasmine now clung to Miller, absorbed by his story. Dry data had transformed into a memoir, part tragedy, part penance, difficult to turn away from. A lawmaker in the front row nodded faintly, as if acknowledging his composure and courage. A reporter whispered, "This is no defense. This is a redefinition." Jasmine felt the tide slipping. She had believed the rumor would hold long enough to pin Miller to the defensive, but he had overturned the board. Not only did he counter with official documents, he reached into the deepest layer emotion, the one thing the public cannot resist. She bit her lip, eyes still bright, but her heart raced. Cameras continued to fix upon her face, and she knew every flicker could be interpreted as weakness. Miller laid the stack down, eyes locking with hers. His voice was no longer harsh, but calm, like a judge's gavel, signaling the end. "Congresswoman Crockett, if you wish to debate, debate with truth. If you wish to build a career, build it with solutions, not rumors. For every time you invoke the tears of separated children as a political weapon, you do not comfort them. You only reopen a wound that never healed." The room froze. Then a few hands clapped, at first scattered, then swelling into waves. Not everyone, but enough. Jasmine looked around, her smile held in place. She knew she had lost half the audience. The strike she thought mortal had been blocked and turned against her. In the corner, a young reporter murmured, "He didn't just counter. He rebuilt himself." His colleague replied, "Yeah." And Crockett? Tonight, she learned rumors are easy to spread, but facing an opponent armed with both law and emotion, that's a different game entirely. As Miller stepped down from the podium, his stride was slow but firm, and the hall was still bathed in an eerie silence. Not the tension of before, but recognition. He had turned defense into attack records, into narrative a public trial, into proof that he still commanded the power to shape opinion. Jasmine remained seated, her face unmoving. She had not shattered, but her eyes lost a measure of their arrogance. She understood the duel was not over, but from now on, every move she made would be far less free. The atmosphere in the chamber felt like a suspended verdict, taut, unresolved, but not yet detonated. After Miller's counterstrike with documents and his family's story, the applause still echoed faintly, lingering like an aftertaste that refused to fade. Jasmine knew she was losing the initiative. If it ended here, she would be branded as a peddler of baseless rumors, erased from the political stage before she had even found her footing. She clenched her teeth, drew a deep breath, and sprang to her feet. Hand raised, microphone seized, her voice rang out. "Wait, I have yet to hear a word of moral responsibility from Mr. Miller. Yes, he has produced papers. Yes, he has told an emotional family story. But has he ever stood before the crying children in the detention camps? Has he ever looked into the eyes of their parents, torn apart in despair? He hides behind documents. But the real pain, has he ever dared to face it?" The question seared through the hall. Murmurs rose again. Some reporters leaned forward, cameras clicking in a new frenzy. Jasmine pressed her advantage, driving the narrative toward morality, where law could not shield Miller absolutely. Miller remained still. He did not snatch the microphone, did not interrupt. He let Jasmine hurl every word daggers in succession, and when she finally paused, breathless with tension, he advanced half a step. His voice dropped, not loud, not harsh, but cold, slicing clean through the air. Congresswoman Crockett. His eyes locked on hers. The entire chamber fell silent. The truth is already painful enough. 2,800 families were shattered. Children crying in the night, parents in despair, we all know this. And I will carry that stain to my grave. He paused, letting each word fall like a gavel strike. Then his tone hardened, glacial. But you have turned that pain into a tool to polish your name. And that is more shameful than the policy you condemn. The words landed like a sentence. No theatrics, no statistics, just a single surgical cut that stripped away Jasmine's glittering facade. The hall froze. Cameras ceased to flash. Reporters froze in place as though this moment demanded memory, not ink. Jasmine stood motionless. Her confident smile remained, but stiffened, twisted, and lifeless. For the first time, her silence was not a weapon, but proof of defeat. She tried to speak, lips twitching, but no words came. All eyes bore into her, no longer with eager expectation, but with scrutiny, some even with doubt. A lawmaker in the front row tapped his pen against the desk, eyes cold upon her. An older reporter pulled a cigarette, but did not light it, murmuring, "She's just been felled on the spot." His neighbor replied, half pity, half scorn. In politics, attack is an art. But when you weaponize tragedy sooner or later, you'll be struck back. And Miller just gave her the first lesson. Miller inclined his head lightly, stepping back as though his part were finished. He needed no more words. That one sentence had sealed the hearing. Applause rose, not the thunder of a performance, but scattered, heavy affirming. Reporters scrambled, typing furiously headlines, forming in their minds, Crockett sinks, in rumor, Miller, counters, with truth and morality. Jasmine sank back into her seat, her face a mask, but inside turmoil raged. She knew one perfectly timed strike could erase hours of calculation. Tonight she was no longer the one controlling the stage. She had become the exhibit of recklessness in politics. To the audience, Miller's silence had once been a mystery. But Jasmine's silence now, after his blow, was only emptiness, the emptiness of defeat. A question echoed inside her, with no answer. Do I still have a chance to rise? Or has this strike buried my career before it even began? Outside Washington spun on with news headlines and pundit chatter on television. But inside this chamber, which had just witnessed the duel, Jasmine tasted for the first time the true flavor of political defeat, bitter and colder than any silence. That night, before Washington's lights had even dimmed, social media had already erupted. The clip of Stephen Miller countering Jasmine Crockett, especially his final words, "The truth is already painful enough, and for you to turn it into a tool to polish your name is even more disgraceful," spread like wildfire through dry timber. Within an hour, the hashtag #MeMaMomentOfTruth trended at the top of Twitter. Television networks replayed the footage, endlessly branding it the moment that exposed the political game. Even newspapers that once excoriated Miller could not resist the headlines, "Miller's surprise counterattack, when data and emotion defeat rumor." Jasmine Crockett, from rising star to victim of her own weapon. Social media is split into two camps. One denounced Miller as a seasoned manipulator skilled at turning fault into a defensive shield. but the majority were swayed by the precision of his strike against Jasmine clean cold, leaving no opening. By morning, the Washington Post dropped a bombshell investigation. Jasmine's own closest aide, bribed and disillusioned, had leaked internal emails showing she had deliberately plotted the rumor campaign against Miller to gain political spotlight. The words were brutal in their candor. Evidence is unnecessary. All we need is public uproar. The cameras will do the rest. The revelation was the killing stroke. The media pounced, recasting her from rising star into the cautionary tale of ambition, undone by scheming. On late-night talk, shows pundits dissected her fall. How ironic she tried to wield the suffering of children as her ladder to glory, only to be exposed under the flashbulbs. This moment will go down in history as the textbook example of how not to enter politics. Clips of those commentaries spread widely, each like a nail, sealing the coffin of Jasmine's future. Meanwhile, Miller leveraged his counterstrike to cement his image. He did not gloat. He did not glee. He appeared once in a brief interview, his voice calm and solemn. "I don't want that night's debate remembered as a petty duel. I only wanted to remind us all, when we speak of the tragedy of 2,800 families, we must not turn it into a tool. The truth is painful enough, no one needs to embellish it." The statement was hailed as the perfect closing blow. Miller had not only won, he had repositioned himself no longer merely the emblem of cruelty, but as a man who carried remorse, yet stood resolute. Jasmine's office, in contrast, fell into chaos. Staff fled, some apologizing publicly to salvage their own careers. Donors quietly withdrew. Within party circles, whispers spread, "She is too reckless to trust." On television, her frozen face in the moment after Miller's damning words played on repeat. It became an emblem of defeat, memed and mocked, spreading across feeds at dizzying speed. A late-night host sneered on air. "We've seen politicians cry some storm out, others silenced under questioning, but rarely one devoured by her own rumor like Crockett." The audience roared, while the hashtag #SilentSmile, a cruel nod to her frozen grin, climbed the trending list within hours. Late at night, when the chamber had emptied, only dim lights lingered on the red carpet. Jasmine sat alone. Empty chairs surrounded her. No reporters, no cameras. Only darkness, colder and heavier than any silence Miller had ever wielded. She glanced around as if hoping someone remained, but all had left. The last footsteps of the audience had faded. Only her sigh echoed in the vacant hall. Jasmine knew the battle was over. This was not merely a stumble. It was the end of an ambition barely born. The stain would cling long after on her political record, in the public memory, and in every future stage where she dared to stand. Washington still blazed with light that night. But for Jasmine Crockett, the flashbulbs were gone. All that remained was darkness and the bitter aftertaste of a costly lesson in politics. Truth may wound, but rumor wielded wrongly will destroy its maker.